Welcome to Optimize This House, where I'm going to take you on my journey of cool DIY projects where some are necessary, but really most are not. All right, so here we are at the edge of the backyard where we have a little fire pit and some seating where we can chill out and just enjoy the view. When you're sitting on the couch in front of the fire pit, it's great. But when you're sitting on the chairs off to the side, it's a little bit weird to have this fence and this hand railing right next to your head. So what I want to do in this totally unnecessary project is to lower this first section of fence to make this whole area feel a little bit bigger and to make these seats at the ends a better place to sit. My plan will be to cut the wooden rail so I can drop a piece of it down to the lowered position, cut the leftmost post, and also shorten the top 5 cables. The top 4 cables will be pretty easy. I just pull them through to the second post and then cut off the excess at the far end. But the 5th cable is going to be a little bit more complicated because the hole where it's supposed to be anchored is going to be covered by the lowered railing. So I have to come up with a way to anchor it inside that second post. We'll get the cable ready by cutting off the crimped fitting on the end, and then we'll come back to it later. The next thing I want to do is mark and cut the wood handrail, and then mark and cut the post. Figuring out where to cut the metal post was pretty easy. It's exactly 3 inches between all the cables and also 3 inches to the metal railing that the wood bolts onto. So I just decided to cut the post right in the middle of the 5th hole. That way I'll maintain this 3-inch spacing even in this shorter section of fence. Okay, so now let's come back to that 5th cable. I've fetted up the inside of the second post, and what I've decided to do is put a washer and crimp a couple of aluminum ferrules to the end of the cable. Then when I put this cable back down into that post and pull it through, the washer will act as an anchor and keep the cable stuck inside the post. And now that the 5th cable is done, I can start to put the handrail back together at its new height. The handrail is hollow, and the way that it attaches to the posts is with these little mounts that you screw onto the post, and then the handrail slides on top of the mount. Doing one side is pretty easy, but it's impossible for me to get the handrail slid onto a mount on the other end because the posts are fixed in place. So I'm assuming that when they put these handrails in initially, that they assembled it to the posts and then fixed the post to the concrete. So what I'm going to do is notch out the bottom of the handrail on the other end and then pop it down on top of the mount. So with my angle grinder and a file, I just cut away at that handrail until I got a nice snug fit for that mount. And then it just popped right in place. So we're getting pretty close to the end here. I just need to reattach the wood handrail and clean up the slack on those top 5 cables. For the wood handrail, I'm just going to clamp it to the metal top rail and reuse the screw holes that are already there. And for the steel cables, I'm going to have to cut off all this slack with my angle grinder and then crimp on some new threaded studs onto the ends. So there's a little bit of measuring you need to do here before you cut the cable. You need to have enough cable to crimp inside of the threaded stud, but not so much that you end up leaving slack. And you need to leave enough threaded stud sticking out the other side of the post so that you can tighten or loosen the cable with the nut that goes on the end. So I used one of my clamps to hold the cable where it goes into the post, and then I calculated I needed to cut the cable about 1.25 inches from that point. And this calculation would be different if the post were a different size or if the threaded stud was longer or shorter. After you cut the cable, you take one of the threaded studs and you crimp it onto the end. And I actually crimped each one of these in 2 different spots because I figured it couldn't hurt to make it more secure. I bought this hydraulic crimping tool from Amazon. It wasn't very expensive, so I don't expect that it's of the highest quality, but it was certainly good enough for this project. So with the threaded stud crimped onto the cable, I can put it back through the post and then secure it with the nut. The final step is to put a cap nut on the end of the threaded stud. And to do that, I use my angle grinder to cut off the excess threads, leaving only about 1/4 inch so the cap nut could screw onto the end. I didn't film this part because I couldn't quite get the angle with my camera, but it's pretty similar to how you saw me cut the steel cable earlier. So that's it. I did the same thing with the other 4 cables on this side, and then repeated the entire process for the other side of the fire pit. And that brings us to our project wrap-up. This project actually wasn't that difficult. I think the most complicated part was trying to figure out how I was going to anchor that 5th cable inside the post, since I wasn't going to be able to use a threaded stud because the hole was going to be covered by the lowered handrail. It was also a little bit nerve-wracking because once you start cutting those posts, you're committed. You have to keep going. So this is where measure twice and cut once is probably the smartest thing you can do. But otherwise, there was nothing super complicated or super technical with it, and so I would give this a difficulty of 5 out of 10. Overall, it took me about 8 hours to do both sides of the fire pit, and of course, the first side took much longer than the second side. It wasn't very expensive to do this project. I only had to buy the crimping tool and the threaded end studs to put on the ends of those steel cables. Now, I also used some power tools. I used my drill driver and an angle grinder. And I think it would have been really hard to do this project without those 2 things. So those are probably required tools, but I didn't include the cost for those here. And the most important question, was it worth it? Yes, it was totally worth it. Now, I kind of screwed up and I didn't take a good photo or take any good video of the fire pit area before I did this project. So you'll just have to take my word for it when I say that having the fence right up against the fire pit and right up against those 2 chairs really makes the whole area feel much smaller. And so now with those 2 sections of fence lowered, the entire area just feels much bigger for everybody who's sitting there. So it's a very small change, and you wouldn't expect it to have a big impact because after all, they're just steel cables. It's not like a wall. But once I lowered those sections of fencing, the whole area just felt way, way bigger. So yeah, for $75 in 8 hours, this was a huge improvement to our enjoyment of the fire pit area. And with that, I think I've earned myself a little bit of kickback time with a tasty beverage. Thanks for watching Optimize This House. Make sure to like and subscribe, etc., etc. And yeah, check out my other videos.